In July of 2010, Newsweek ran a cover story entitled "The Creativity Crisis." It was a pretty sobering article, concluding that Americans at that time were significantly less creative than they were 25 years prior. And that assertion was made citing research of scores from a test that measures the creative aptitude among children, known as the Torrance Test of Creative Thinking. Now, it's a widely or well-regarded test within the scientific community. It's been around since like the 1950s. And when you take a look at the data over time, it was pretty clear that the score started a nosedive right around 1990. Now you might say, well, how much of a nosedive are we talking about? Well, in one of the areas of the test, known as elaboration, which is basically the ability to take an idea and build upon it in a new and interesting way, 85% of the respondents in 2008 scored below the average of respondents in 1984. This was not a trivial decline. In fact, I don't think it was an overstatement to call this a crisis. Now, the authors of the article cited three main drivers of the decline. One was an increase in television viewing. Kids spending more time sort of passively consuming entertainment rather than actively engaged in creating and imagining things. Second was the rise in video gaming. So more time spent on activities that are geared more around mastery and achievement than around creativity. And then the final factor is the increase in standardized testing in US schools. And the consequence of that, of course, is that you ultimately have more time being spent in schools on those subjects that are tested, like English and math, and less time being spent on those things that are not tested, like art, drama, music, and even recess. So that was the article in a nutshell, and it created quite a bit of buzz when it was published. A lot of concern expressed from parents to educators to business people to politicians. And I actually remember when the article came out, I was quite struck by it. So I couldn't help but wonder recently, whatever happened to the creativity crisis? So I did a little bit of digging. And the short answer is not much, actually. It just pretty much fizzled right out of the mainstream media. Now, there was a book published, though, last September called The Creativity Challenge: How We Can Recapture American Innovation. And that book was written by Dr. Kyung-hee Kim, who is a professor at the College of William & Mary. Now, interestingly, it was Dr. Kim's research of the Torrance test scores that sparked the Newsweek article in 2010. So her book was a bit of an update on where we stand. And unfortunately, the conclusion in her book is that the decline in American creativity continues with no end in sight. And as a matter of fact, the latest round of Torrance data for 2017 has yet to be published, but Dr. Kim is currently working with the data, and she confirmed with me via email that not only does the decline continue, but it does so at an accelerating rate. Now, in her book, she actually cites two additional factors that are causing the recent decline. One is a change in parenting styles. So increasingly, you see parents who are more involved, more engaged, more protective, more directive. And that actually gives kids fewer degrees of freedom to sort of think for themselves and to explore their own worlds. Secondly, there's an increase in economic uncertainty. And especially coming out of the recession of 2008 and 2009, you have more and more parents who are just concerned about the economic future of their kids. And what that has led to is an increase in sort of resume building at younger and younger ages. So you have much more time spent on structured and organized activities, and that's time coming away from open-ended and free play. And then, of course, also Dr. Kim points to the fact that the drive toward more standardized testing in US schools continues unabated. So why does all this matter? Why should we really care? Well, I think that there are two pretty fundamental reasons, at least. One is pretty obvious, which is that creativity is quite fundamental to our quality of life. Right? I mean, if we think about, just for example, some of the things that inspire us most in life. It could be a favorite book, your favorite music, your favorite piece of art, your favorite film, etc. All of those come to us courtesy of very creative people who had original ideas and the talent and the guts to bring them to life. We don't want to see that diminish, right? But where I want to focus is on another reason, which is admittedly more practical. And that is that I'm fearful that the decline in creativity could very well lead to a decline in the standard of living in the US. And the reason I say that is that the decline in creativity is coinciding with an increase in digitalization and globalization, two forces that are creating a hyper-connected world in which change is happening with great speed and great significance. Just to reflect on some examples here, I mean, just think about all of the things that we do today that are profoundly different than the way that we do them, say, or did them 5 or 10 years ago. Think about the way that we shop, the way that we listen to music, the way that we watch television, the way that we socialize, the way that we book taxi cabs, the way that we date, the way that we order hotel rooms, all of these things have been transformed in a very short period of time. Not to mention the fact that there's a lot of change going on right now in the geopolitical landscape, as we well know. Now, some people would characterize this as a VUCA world, which is an acronym standing for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And unfortunately, Dr. Kim concludes that we have an increasingly limited number of people who have the ability to find and implement the solutions that are going to face us in this VUCA world. So, now, you might be wondering, hang on a minute, there's a flaw in your argument. Because the very disruption that you're talking about is proof positive that American ingenuity is alive and well. Because many of those changes you talked about are basically representing innovations that have come disproportionately from American companies. And that's true. But that misses a very important nuance, which is that all of those are examples from the technology sector. And the tech sector is not exactly representative of the economy more broadly. In fact, when you take a look at a lot of the indicators for ingenuity across the economy more broadly, it tells a less inspiring story. Tyler Cohen, who just published a book called The Complacency Class, cited that the following measures are all down in recent years: productivity in virtually every sector of the US economy, startups as a share of US firms, and net capital investment as a share of GDP, right? At the same time, Anne-Marie Knott, who's a professor at Washington University's Business School, has been studying research and development spending among American companies. And she recently published an article in which she concluded that the return on R&D spending across American companies is down 65% over the last 30 years. Moreover, she goes on to prove that much of that decline is not driven by structural changes in the economy. It's much more driven by the fact that American companies are just getting worse at innovating. So, how do we turn all this around? I think the obvious answer is we need a vigorous refocus on creativity, and also I think it's close cousin curiosity. And I say curiosity because that will make us a lot more tolerant of ambiguity and also more inclined to continually learn in a world that's constantly changing. So, to sort of illustrate the importance of creativity and curiosity, I want to kind of give you a little bit of a metaphor using Lego building, all right? Now, imagine that I were to give everybody here sort of a small bag of red and yellow bricks, okay? And we do two different exercises. First exercise is I just ask you to build a duck, whatever you think a duck should look like, right? And chances are we'd probably see something like this, right? A different duck from everybody in the room, all right? Second exercise is I then hand you out a set of instructions on how to build a specific duck. And the exercise would be a competition to see who could build that duck to the instructions the fastest, right? The first exercise is all about creative problem solving. The second exercise is all about efficiency and optimization. And I think it's the first exercise that's far more representative of the kind of work that's going to be required of us in a VUCA world, right? Many of the challenges that we're going to be faced with, and even currently are faced with, don't come with an obvious right or wrong answer. They certainly don't come with a set of instructions. And they're the types of problems where there are many different types of solutions to them. So, how do we reorient around creativity and curiosity? Well, when it comes to doing that with kids, we already have a bit of a start, right? There are some amazing TED Talks and books and articles from brilliant people like Sir Ken Robinson and Tony Wagner and Peter Gray. People who've done amazing work and have super compelling insights and ideas on how to go about everything from education reform to reorienting around play as ways of really boosting creativity among kids. Although, as Dr. Kim points out, we definitely could use and need continual scientific research in this space, but it's not as if we don't have a base of ideas to start with. Yet, despite all the great work that's been done there, the creativity crisis still persists, which tells me that we're in this mess not because we don't know or have ideas on how to get out of it, but rather we don't have the focus and attention against it. Now, what gets even less attention is how do we improve creativity among adults? And for that, I think the answer could, at least maybe in part, lie in a mantra that our company tries to embrace, which is that children are our role models. And I realize that this, mantra could be a little counterintuitive, right? Because it's like, you know, what is it that we can learn from children? Being adults, we're so much more mature and, you know, worldly and experienced. But when it comes to creativity and curiosity, those are traits that come far more naturally to kids than they do to adults, right? I mean, kids are constantly asking questions. They have a natural urge to play. And they're also much better at more sort of freely expressing themselves without being overly concerned about what other people think, right? But those tendencies diminish significantly as we age. We enter into institutions like schools or businesses that place a much higher premium on having the right answer rather than on asking questions, right? Also, our free time diminishes rather significantly when we age, allowing us less opportunity to indulge in certain curiosities. And then finally, as we age, we do, let's face it, we become a lot more self-conscious, which can be an inhibitor to offering up original thinking. So, now I realize that this metaphor does have some limits. I mean, we don't want to act like children all the time. We probably need to be a little selective. So I think that there are basically 3 key ways in which we can take inspiration from young kids on how to boost our creativity and curiosity. The first is to make more time to play, all right? Now, there's no way that we're going to boost our creativity and curiosity by being as busy and overcommitted as we are. Adam Grant, who wrote an awesome book on creativity called Originals, cited the fact that people who have started businesses or contributed to patent applications are far more likely to have leisure time activities in things like drawing, painting, sculpting, architecture, literature. And the idea there is that when we're engaged in those kinds of activities, our brain is able to make connections that it otherwise wouldn't when our brains are constantly in work mode. Perhaps George Bernard Shaw said it best when he said, "We don't stop playing because we grow old. We grow old because we stop playing." And my fear is that in a VUCA world, the aging process is going to accelerate pretty rapidly for people who aren't appropriately playful and creative. Second is do your bedtime reading, all right? And the whole idea here is that we can boost our creativity by expanding our horizons and broadening our perspectives on things. And reading is a pretty cheap and easy way to do that. My favorite example of this is of a company named or called Performance Sports Group, and they make sporting goods equipment. And they're right now testing a prototype of a device to prevent concussions in people who play contact sports, right? They designed this device by studying woodpeckers. Now, I gotta be honest, I have never in my life wondered why it is that woodpeckers do what they do without getting concussions. But they did. Great example of broadening your horizons to generate creative ideas. Thirdly, relentlessly ask why not, right? Kids do this all the time. And largely because they don't really know what's not possible, right? There's a great story of a guy named Edwin Land who was on vacation in 1943 with his family, and he took a picture of his 3-year-old daughter. And she obviously wanted to see the picture right then. And he said, "Well, you can't." And she said, "Why not?" And he then went about the process of explaining to a 3-year-old how film gets developed. So you can imagine how that conversation went. But the whole point around this is that her relentless persistence around this ultimately led him to invent the instant camera, which turned out to be a pretty helpful boost for the company that he founded called Polaroid, right? Steve Jobs was also famously known for having a reality distortion field. Now, the way that Steve distorted reality is that he would basically just not acknowledge limits or constraints on things, right? I mean, he basically, anytime somebody would say, "Yeah, Steve, that's a good idea, but we can't," because Steve would then just break into la, 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 you know. And it was that kind of childlike behavior that I'm sure drove his coworkers crazy, but it ultimately led to some of the greatest inventions in recent history. Now, unfortunately, it seems as if society is actually going in the opposite direction of this mantra. Rather than adults becoming more like kids, kids seem to be becoming more like adults. Overscheduled, overregulated, and overregimented. It shouldn't shock us that creativity scores are plummeting. So, what do we need to do? I think we as adults have an obligation to create the conditions for kids that allow them to do what they do best, which is to be kids, to be naturally creative and curious. Let's not rush them into adulthood. And then for ourselves, we need to then take their lead. You know, this idea of children needing to be our role models is not some kind of quaint, cute little thing. I think it's imperative in a world that's going to be increasingly valuing creativity and curiosity. And a good case could be made for the fact that creativity and curiosity are even more valuable than cognitive intelligence. The Newsweek article cited an Indiana University study in which they tracked people over time, and they found that lifetime creative achievement in adults was more than 3 times more highly correlated with childhood creativity than it was with childhood IQ. New York University also did a study where they took a look at students, college students, and they found an inverse relationship between GPA and an innovation orientation. Sometimes good students can tend to be conformists and have a lower risk profile, and that can lead, again, to less original thinking. Finally, Google has all but abandoned the use of SAT scores and GPA in their hiring practices because after a lot of analysis, they have found zero predictive ability between these measures and the prospects of success and productivity of an employee later on. These are really important points that I think are especially relevant for elite students who obsess over these measures like GPA and test scores. And my fear is that people who do well on those metrics are going to have a false sense of security of their prospects for success in this future world. Now, by the way, for those of you who are students, feel free to use that argument next time you need a little bit of air cover with your folks after a disappointing grade, you know? You're welcome. No, in all seriousness, there is a ton at stake here for us and especially for kids. And ultimately, I'm not saying here that what I've outlined is a silver bullet solution to the creativity crisis, but we know one thing for sure, and empirically we know, ignoring it isn't going to make it go away. Winston Churchill once said, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." Let's not continue to let the creativity crisis go to waste. Thank you.